Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. Welcome to another tutorial, and today we'll be making a Valentine's Day mug rug. All right, so before we get right into it, this will be a very similar process to the one we did back in December or November was it, for Christmas. So you can definitely use scraps here. You'll need to find scrap fabric for your heart. You'll need to find fabric for your background, fabric for your binding if you want it to be different from your background. And then, of course, fabric for your backing piece. The finished size of our mug rug is going to be about 6 inches high by 7 inches wide. So take that into account when you are deciding what fabric to use for the backing and for the binding, because you want to make sure that you'll have enough fabric to cut 2.5 strips or 2.5-inch strips that are long enough to go around your mug rug and leave a bit of a tail so that we can connect them at the end. So look through your scraps or through your fat quarters. I'm going to put all of the cutting guide or all of your instructions for cutting your fabric down in the description box, but I'm going to get going cutting my fabric, and I'll see you back when I'm done that. All right, so here is, before I go into the cut pieces or everything I've cut, I thought I'd go through quickly the tools you'll need or besides your fabric. So I have 2 rulers here. I'm going to use the small ruler to trace stitching lines on my half square triangles, and I'll show you how to do that later. And then I'll use a slightly bigger ruler to square up the mug rug once it is quilted and before I apply the binding to it. So if you've got a couple of rulers, that would be good. Next, obviously, have a rotary cutter to cut your pieces. I'm going to use just a regular pen to trace my stitching lines. You will never see these lines. They'll be tucked away inside the mug rug. So if you have a pencil, that's great. If you have a disappearing ink pencil, it's even better, but use what you have. And then before quilting my mug rug, I like to mark my lines with this. This is a Hera marker. It basically creases your fabric so that you can see where to stitch without leaving any marks. So I love to use this for my smaller projects where I'm going to be stitching straight lines for the quilting. You'll obviously need a sewing machine. If you have a 1/4-inch foot on your sewing machine, that's great because it makes for very accurate piecing. And a walking foot is also good for then quilting your mug rug once your quilt sandwich is put together. And then, of course, you know, you'll need thread and you'll need snips to cut off the threads, and pins if you want to pin the pieces as you sew them. So yeah, and that's pretty much all you'll need in terms of tools and fabrics. So I'm done cutting all of my fabrics. Now for the hearts, I've decided to go with this darker pink, and I've got 2 pieces that are 5 inches by 3 inches. So this will be basically the 2 sides to our heart. So you need 2 3x5 pieces of your heart fabric. For the background, I'm going to be using a very pale pink fabric. And for that, you're going to need 4 1.5-inch squares. So I've got 4 of these squares. You're going to need 2 3-inch squares. Then a 2.5 by 6 rectangle, and you only need 1 of these. So that's my rectangle here. And finally, 2 strips that are 1 inch wide by a little more than 6 inches. Don't cut these to 6 inches yet. I left mine long on purpose, just in case our little mug rug top is not exactly 7 inches. So I should say, don't cut these to size just yet, because we'll just stitch them on and then square everything up once we're done with the quilt top. So that's for our quilt top. For my backing, I'm going to use the same pink, which is full of little bear hair, and it needs a press, but this will be, I think, big enough. And then I cut this gray fabric into 2.5 inch strips that I'm going to sew together to make my binding. And I'm going to show you how to make your binding when we get there. All right, so I've got all of my fabric pieces all set and ready to go. So let's get piecing. Okay, the first step is to basically put our heart together. So to do that, you're going to take your 4 squares, your 4 1.5 inch squares, and you're going to put them right sides together in the corners. So you're going to start with the first one. So I've got my little square on the upper, as I'm looking at this, on the upper left side. And I'm going to take a ruler and mark a line corner to corner here, which I'm then going to stitch on top of. What this is going to allow us to do, and this is basically a stitch and flip method. So you're going to stitch across here, and then we're going to take our iron and flip the triangle up this way. After trimming it, it's going to start to look like our heart here. So you're going to do this with the first square. Take a ruler, mark this. I would typically just eyeball it at the machine, but if this is the first time you're making or if you're using the stitch and flip method, just mark it. And I'm going to stitch on top of that. We're then going to trim 1/4 inch away from that line and then flip it this way. And we're going to repeat that 4 times for each of the corners at the top of our heart fabric. So this way. You do have to stitch each one at a time before adding the next one, because there might be a little bit of an overlap over here, and that's fine. So just do them once at a time. So I'm going to go and stitch my line here, and then I'll come back to show you what we need to do next. All right, so I've stitched on the blue line here. So now I'm going to take my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to measure 1/4 inch from the blue line and trim. And this is basically either teddy bear stuffing or whatever. So it's a very tiny scraps. And then I'm going to take my iron and flip this over so that I'm basically left here with the same size rectangle that I started with. All right. And once I've pressed this flat, I'm going to take my second square, put it on the opposite corner or on the right-hand side corner here, and then mark my line diagonally this way. So I'll show you by marking it so you can see it. All right. So I'm going to go to my machine now and stitch on the blue line and basically do the exact same thing, trimming 1/4 inch away from the line and then flipping the triangle over. And at the end of this whole process, we're going to end up with the same size rectangle that we started with, but it's now going to have the 2 corners in a lighter fabric or in a contrasting fabric. So I'm going to go and stitch my second line and show you what that looks like when we're done. All right, so I've stitched on my second square. I'm now gonna look for my 1/4 inch distance between the stitching line and make a cut, and then press this one over, just like I did the first one, ending up with a rectangle that is basically the exact same size that we started with. Okay, and I will press these to make them nice and flat before I move on. So go ahead and take your second heart piece and do the exact same thing. Put in your first square, mark your stitching line, stitch, trim, flip, and do this twice with your 2 remaining squares. All right, so I've pressed my rectangles. Now the next step is to take your 3-inch squares, and we're gonna do another stitch and flip. But this time we're gonna put them at the bottom of our rectangles, like so. And now it's very important that you mark these so that you know exactly where to stitch, because we're gonna stitch this way on this rectangle and that way on this one. And that way, when we flip them over, we're gonna have a nice heart. All right, so I'm gonna take my pen and mark my first one this way. And then we're gonna mark the second one this way. And I'm gonna go over to the sewing machine and stitch on both lines. All right, so I've stitched on both lines, and now we're gonna do the exact same thing by trimming and leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both. Okay, and now you can go to your pressing station and flip your triangles this way and then this way and press flat. And then we're gonna come back and join our 2 pieces. Okay, so now we've got our 2 halves of the heart, and we're gonna sew them together by putting them right sides together like this. And what you want to be doing here is matching as much as you can your seams at the bottom, so they line up almost perfectly, and your seams at the top here, so they match as much as you can. And you can definitely put some pins in there. Where are my pins? Hold on. So I'm going to put a pin at the top, and I'm going to put a pin at the bottom. I'm going to try to keep those seams together when I'm sewing down this side here. So I'll do that and come back. All right, so I've pressed this, I've sewn my seam, and I've pressed the seam open so that it was nice and flat. And you'll notice that I managed to match my seams pretty well at the top here. It's off by a hair down here, but I'm really not going to worry about that. So the next step is to take your strips, your 1-inch strips, and sew them at the top and at the bottom of your little heart. So sew them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and when you're done, flip them over or press them to the side, and then we're going to trim the excess fabric here that we won't need. All right, so I've sewn my 2 strips, or to my 2 border pieces, to the top and bottom. I've then trimmed with my ruler the excess fabric on both sides. So now we're ready to piece our 2.5 inch rectangle to one of the sides. So I pieced mine to the left side because that's what I prefer, but you can piece it to the right side. It's really up to you. What you could even do is cut this into two pieces. So instead of cutting a 2.5 rectangle, you could cut two, let's say 1.5 strips, and piece them on either side of your heart and still end up with the same size mug rug, but your heart would be centered, except as opposed to off to the side. So I'm going to piece my rectangle to the left-hand side of my heart, again at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to press my seam, and I'll join you back here. All right, so we've got our little mug rug top. Now's the time to put our sandwich together. So for that, you're going to need your backing piece, and we're going to put that right side down. You're going to need a piece of batting that's about the same size as your backing, and we're going to put that on top. And then you're going to take your mug rug and center it as best you can on top of the batting. And you're going to want a little more wiggle room on the side than I do here. I really don't have a whole lot of room to maneuver here, so I'm going to have to be very careful when I quilt this so that I don't end up with a piece of batting that's basically too small. So once you've got your sandwich here, you can pin it together if you like, but it's so small. It should stay together. Now, you can go and put your walking foot on your machine because we're going to be stitching some straight lines on this cute quilt. Now, here's the first one I made, and I decided to quilt it with a grid that's about 1 inch apart. So I used my hair marker that I showed you before to mark these lines. So what you do, if you have one of these, is you take your ruler and decide on a starting point. So I can decide I'm going to start right here by guiding myself on the seam line here, and basically take your marker and just run it against the quilt top. And when you remove your ruler, you'll see a very clear indent that you can stitch all across. And then you can keep marking 1 inch apart, again with your hair marker. If you've got disappearing ink pen, you can use that. Of course, always test your marking instrument to make sure it's gonna indeed disappear. And then just quilt. If you don't want to do on the diagonal, you can do straight up and down, straight sideways, wavy lines across the top. That's up to you. You can do all of those things with your walking foot. So I'm going to go ahead and quilt mine with diagonal lines like I did my first one. And I'll meet you back here for squaring up our little mug rug. All right, and I'm back. And my little mug rug is all quilted, and I love it. So now I'm going to square it before we attach the binding. So squaring it basically means just removing the excess batting and backing on all 4 sides, and trying to get as close as a 90-degree angle at the corner as you can. So I'm using the lines on my ruler and lining them up to one of the sides that I've cut already to try and get close to 90 degrees at the corners. And there we go. There's my little squared up mug rug. So I'm going to set this aside for a minute because we have to make our binding. So I ended up with 3 stripes of about 18 inches each. You need 32 to 36 inches of binding to bind this mug rug. So I'm going to piece all of these together end to end to end up with 36 inches long. Then after I've done that, I'm going to go to my ironing station and press my long strip in half, wrong sides together like this, to prepare the binding that we can then sew to our mug rug. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'll piece all 3 of these end to end and press them in half, ready to apply to our mug rug. Right, so I've got my binding already. I've got my mug rug, and I'm using some Wonder Clips to hold the binding to the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to start on one of the short sides, and you should have more than enough to go around. So what I do is I like to line up right here at the top, but we're not going to start sewing until like almost close to the bottom, like right here. So although I'm lining it up at the top here, I'm going to start sewing right here, go to the corner, and then, you know, flip to the right, flip to the left. If you've not put a binding on a quilt before, I will link to the last mug rug tutorial I did, and I go through all of these steps in a lot more detail than I will here. But basically, you start sewing here, you get to about 1/4 inch from the edge, and you turn 45 degrees towards the corner and completely go off the quilt, cut your thread. Then you take your binding, flip it to the right, flip it to the left, making a nice fold lined up to the edge, and then start sewing from here all the way down the other side and keep going around till you get back to the beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the binding on the front of this mug rug, and then I'll come back. All right. So I've sewn the binding onto the top. This is what it looks like. So all I need to do now is flip it to the back and just put my clips all around just to hold it like this. Oops. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to go around and do this to all 4 sides, trying to have some nice, crisp, mitered corners. There we go. And now I'm going to go to the right side and stitch in the ditch as close as I can to the binding, but onto the quilt. So with my walking foot, I'm going to put the needle down right next to the binding and stitch all the way around, and then we'll be done. So I'll come back when I've done that. All right. And there we go. Whoops. I have my little mug rug all done and finished, and I love it. Now, somebody in the comments when I talked about this, oh my goodness, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember who it was, but you could use this as a Valentine's Day card instead of buying a card by using fabric markers and either signing the front or writing a nice message on the back and then signing the back. So it's almost like a postcard. I thought, yeah, I think that's so sweet. Now I'm going to keep mine, so I'm not going to put a message on it, but I thought it was a really good idea. So there you go. I'm going to put in the description box down below all of the cutting instructions that you're going to need to make your little mug rug. And I'm also going to put a link to the Christmas mug rug video where I give you a lot of detailed information on sewing your binding onto your mug rug. So that's it. Hopefully you make at least one of these for yourself, but if you do make more and give them as gifts, I would love to know. Now, if you have any questions whatsoever, please put them in the comments box below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, well, thank you so much for stopping by. If you liked the video, please give it a like on your way out and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.